The Lamentations of Jeremiah is one of the most poignant and heartbreaking books in the Old Testament. Set against the backdrop of the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, this book captures the sorrow and despair of a prophet witnessing his beloved city fall into ruin. Jeremiah, often referred to as the weeping prophet, poured his heart into this collection of poetic laments. His writings express grief not just for the loss of a city, but for a people who have lost their way spiritually. The poems of Lamentations are more than just a response to physical destruction. They are a reflection on the consequences of disobedience to God, the weight of sin, and the deep yearning for redemption and healing. To understand the Lamentations, we must first understand the context in which Jeremiah wrote. Jerusalem had been the center of worship and the symbol of God's presence among his people. But after years of warnings and prophecies, the Babylonians, under King Nebuchadnezzar, finally laid siege to the city. They destroyed the temple, the walls, and the homes, leaving nothing but devastation. The people were either killed, taken into captivity, or left destitute. It was a catastrophic moment in Jewish history. Lamentations is Jeremiah's cry of anguish, his way of processing the overwhelming sense of loss and despair. But even amid his lament, there is an underlying theme of hope, a hope that God's mercies will one day return to his people. But before we go any deeper into this amazing little book, I want to reach out to you. Please subscribe if you are enjoying this conversation. Your support allows us to create educational content that dives deep into the Bible. If you have ever wanted to find the connections and understand more about other books in the Bible, or you desire to belong to a community that is interested in understanding faith together, subscribe now. Lamentations is a unique book in that it does not follow the typical narrative style of other prophetic works. It is not a single poem, but 5 discrete poems detailing the destruction of Jerusalem and the suffering of its people. The structure itself is intriguing. 4 of the 5 chapters are acrostic poems, where each verse begins with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. This ordered arrangement stands in stark contrast to the chaos and mayhem that is being depicted. It is almost as if Jeremiah wants to try to bring some sense of order in the chaos, revealing that there is still the hand of God creating with the structure of his word, even within one who feels no hope. The poems are powerful and sharp, with evocative imagery that captures the city crumbling, the ensuing famine, and the sorrow over which even a prophetic lament finds its depth. The themes of Lamentations are intricate and dense. This book, however, goes through the idea of divine justice. That is, it was not by mere happenstance that Jerusalem was destroyed as an act of war, but a direct result in how the people had been unfaithful to God. God in the Old Testament had been sending prophet after prophet like Jeremiah among them to warn his people over and over that they were bringing judgment on themselves because of their sins, worshiping other gods, oppressing the poor, and ignoring his commands. And now Lamb has come into that judgment. Grief-won compassion can be far from simple. Justice hits close to the bone. But that is just a morsel snack in comparison. That's something that broke Jeremiah. Not just the physical aspects of goodwill or broken walls, but especially the breach in the relationship. They hate to see something beautiful apart, and the knowledge that it could have been maintained. There is also an important concept of repentance and restoration prevalent. The lament of Jeremiah is an example of a lamentation that is not simply a cry for help. Instead, it is a cry for the people to remember their sins and repent, mourning what has been lost, returning, hopefully, to God. However, there is always a silver lining in between each poem, and God's mercy will eventually be attainable even at our lowest. Lamentations show us that mourning is a good and appropriate thing. It reminds us of what pain feels like. It is for this that the book has been read and loved throughout the ages, but particularly so at times of national mourning. Voices aching for words we so often cannot find. We'll break down each chapter in detail, beginning with chapter 1, which introduces us to the city of Jerusalem, personified as a weeping woman. She sits in solitude, mourning the loss of her children and her glory. This first poem sets the tone for the entire book, showing us the weight of loss and the loneliness that sin has brought upon the people. Therefore, we are going to start with chapter 1, We'll look at the key themes, the literary structure, and the theological messages embedded within Jeremiah's words. This chapter, titled The City in Ruins, sets the stage by presenting us with a stark image of Jerusalem's desolation. In the following study of its verses, we will discover the true meaning behind Jeremiah's lament and how it, as a result, remains one of the most compelling reminders against forsaking God. Stay with us as we dive into the opening chapter of this masterpiece. The first chapter. The first chapter of Lamentations opens with a striking and haunting image of Jerusalem, a city that was once full of life, but now feels empty and forsaken, almost like a grieving widow mourning the loss of her husband. The poet, who's usually associated with the prophet Jeremiah, vividly captures a city stripped of its former glory and left in shambles. Jerusalem is depicted almost as a woman who once basked in greatness, perhaps surrounded by friends and allies, but now stands completely alone, abandoned by everyone she trusted. It's a heart-wrenching picture, not just of physical ruin, but of deep emotional and spiritual turmoil that mirrors the people's despair. This chapter is a lament for all that's been lost: the city's grandeur, the people's identity, and their bond with God. Jeremiah opens with a line that cuts straight to the core. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. In those few words, we can almost feel his shock and disbelief. Jerusalem, the cherished city of God, has been reduced to a hollow shell of its former self. That opening line sets the mood for the whole book, laying bare a sense of profound sadness and isolation. The image of the city as a weeping widow keeps coming up throughout the chapter, symbolizing not just the loss of its beauty, but also the death of hope and stability. Even those who were once considered friends have become enemies, leaving Jerusalem to grapple with a crushing sense of betrayal and abandonment. Jeremiah goes on to paint a vivid picture of the city's plight. He talks about how Jerusalem's enemies now jeer at her, reveling in her misfortune. Those who once praised her now bring shame instead. By depicting Jerusalem as a forsaken woman, Jeremiah shows just how deep her humiliation runs. His sorrow isn't just for the ruined buildings and empty streets, but for the moral and spiritual decay that led to this catastrophe in the first place. The city's desolation is a direct result of sin, and Jeremiah acknowledges this with a heavy heart. It's as if the city itself is crying out, not just over its physical destruction, but over the collapse of its moral foundation. As the chapter unfolds, Jeremiah turns his attention to the people of Jerusalem. He describes how those who weren't taken captive are left wandering, hungry, and desperate. The once bustling streets are now eerily empty, filled only with ghosts of the past. The people's suffering is a consequence of their disobedience. Despite all the warnings from the prophets, they chose to ignore the call to change, and now they're living with the consequences of that choice. It's a sobering reminder that actions have far-reaching effects, and that the weight of their mistakes is almost too much to bear. One of the central themes here is the idea of reversal. Jerusalem, once a queen among nations, has now become a lowly slave. The city's leaders, who used to walk with dignity, are now forced to grovel in the dirt. This drastic shift isn't just about military defeat or political turmoil, it's a spiritual unraveling. The people have lost not just their city, but their very identity. They're no longer the chosen people of God, protected and blessed. Instead, they're outcasts, cut off from His presence. Jeremiah's vivid descriptions of this downfall make us feel the sting of each loss, drawing us into the depths of their pain. Throughout the chapter, it's clear that Jerusalem's suffering is linked to its failings. Jeremiah doesn't shy away from pointing this out. He talks about how the people sinned grievously and how their wrongdoings have become like a yoke around their necks. This powerful imagery conveys that their suffering is self-inflicted. His lament isn't just an outpouring of grief, it's a reflection on the devastating consequences of turning away from God. The city's ruin isn't just a punishment, it's a wake-up call, a plea for the people to recognize the seriousness of their choices. And even amid this bleakness, there's a glimmer of hope. By acknowledging their guilt and genuinely repenting, there's still a chance to rebuild. One of the most gut-wrenching scenes is when Jeremiah talks about the cries of the children fainting in the streets. They cry to their mothers, "Where are bread and wine?" he writes, painting a harrowing picture of famine and suffering. The anguish of these innocent children captures the collective pain of the entire community. It's not just the adults or the leaders who are affected, but the very ones who are least deserving of this punishment. This haunting image of starving children crying out is meant to break our hearts, driving home the devastating reach of sin's consequences. As the chapter progresses, Jeremiah's voice seems to blend with the voice of the city itself. At times, it's as if Jerusalem is speaking through him, pouring out her grief and regret. "Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by?" she cries out. This plea is powerful, as if the city is desperate for someone to notice, to care, to understand her suffering. It's more than just a lament, it's a call for empathy, for connection. Lamentation, in its truest form, is about being seen in our pain and finding some semblance of comfort in that recognition. Jeremiah also doesn't let us forget that God is still a part of this story. The destruction of Jerusalem isn't just a consequence of human actions, it's framed as divine judgment. He has cast down from heaven to earth the splendor of Israel, he writes, making it clear that this isn't just about earthly events, but a spiritual reckoning. The people have been unfaithful, and God has allowed their enemies to triumph as a form of punishment. Yet, there's a sliver of hope in the fact that God is still engaged. If he's the one who's brought this calamity, it means he hasn't completely turned his back on them. There's still a relationship, strained as it might be. The city's cries are directed at God, yearning for his mercy and forgiveness. In the end, as the chapter wraps up, Jeremiah offers a plea for God to look upon the city's misery. "Look, O Lord, and see, for I am despised," he writes, capturing the raw essence of the city's brokenness. This sets the stage for what's to come, a deeper exploration of the people's suffering and God's response. It's a painful, necessary confrontation, but also a potential turning point. By recognizing their sin and reaching out to God, the people begin to take their first steps toward healing. Chapter 2 of Lamentations shifts the tone from sorrowful reflection to an intense and vivid depiction of God's wrath. If Chapter 1 focused on the city's suffering and the anguish of its people, Chapter 2 highlights the divine source of that suffering. Jeremiah makes it clear that the destruction of Jerusalem is not just a random occurrence or the result of Babylonian aggression. It is a direct and deliberate act of God's judgment. This chapter emphasizes that the Lord himself has become the city's adversary. For a people who once saw themselves as chosen, the recipients of God's special favor, this revelation is shocking and terrifying. The poetry of this chapter is filled with powerful and unsettling images that depict God as a warrior, striking down his own people in righteous anger. The chapter opens with a powerful statement, how the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with the cloud of his anger. Here, Jeremiah uses the image of a dark cloud to describe God's wrath, which has descended upon Jerusalem like a storm, blotting out all light and hope. The term daughter of Zion is used to personify Jerusalem, emphasizing its vulnerable and precious nature. But now the very one who once protected her has turned against her. The reversal is stark. The God who once surrounded the city with his presence has now surrounded it with his wrath. This image sets the stage for the rest of the chapter, where we see God actively dismantling the city and its defenses, leaving it exposed and defenseless. One of the most striking aspects of this chapter is the way Jeremiah portrays God's actions. He does not describe the destruction as merely the result of human sin or weakness. Instead, he attributes the devastation directly to the hand of God. "The Lord has swallowed up without mercy all the habitations of Jacob," Jeremiah writes. The use of the phrase "without mercy" is particularly harsh, emphasizing that this is not a gentle correction, but a severe and uncompromising punishment. It is as if God has become a consuming fire, devouring everything in his path. The fact that it is God himself who is bringing about this destruction makes the suffering even more intense. It's one thing to suffer at the hands of an enemy, but to suffer at the hands of the very one who was supposed to protect you is an unimaginable tragedy. Jeremiah moves on to describe the specific actions of God's wrath. He has cut down in fierce anger all the strength of Israel. He has withdrawn his right hand. The image of God withdrawing his right hand is symbolic. The right hand is often used in the Bible to represent strength, power, and protection. For God to withdraw it means that he is no longer shielding his people. This is a devastating reality for the people of Jerusalem, who have relied on God's protection for generations. Without his hand, they are left completely vulnerable. The poem goes on to describe how God has bent his bow like an enemy and set his right hand like a foe. The language here is intentionally confrontational. God is no longer the loving father or faithful shepherd. He is depicted as a warrior, armed and ready to strike down his own people. One of the most painful descriptions in this chapter is how God laid waste his booth like a garden. The booth refers to the tabernacle, the very place where God's presence once dwelled among his people. By destroying it, God is not just dismantling a building, he is dismantling the very symbol of his relationship with the people. This destruction of the temple is not just a physical loss, it is a spiritual catastrophe. The place where sacrifices were offered, where prayers were made, where sins were forgiven, has been laid waste. This is a turning point in the history of Israel. It's as if God is saying, the covenant relationship we had is broken, and I am no longer with you in the way I once was. The shock of this statement cannot be overstated. For the people of Israel, the temple was the center of their identity, the place where heaven and earth met. Now it lies in ruins, a stark reminder of how far they have fallen. Jeremiah continues by describing how the Lord has destroyed in his anger the strongholds of the daughter of Judah. This destruction is thorough and complete. The walls that once protected the city, the towers that stood as symbols of strength and security, all have been torn down. The imagery here is relentless. God is not just allowing the enemy to prevail, he is actively participating in the destruction. The prophet uses verbs like swallowed up, broken down, and brought to the ground. Each word carries the weight of finality. There is no escaping this judgment, no reprieve or mercy. The sense of total abandonment is palpable. But perhaps the most heart-wrenching image in this chapter is the description of God's anger against the sanctuary itself. The Lord has scorned his altar, disowned his sanctuary. He has delivered into the hand of the enemy the walls of her palaces. The altar, which was once the place of atonement and forgiveness, is now despised. The sanctuary, where God's glory once dwelled, is now just another ruin. This rejection is absolute. God has not only turned his face away from the people, but also turned his face away from the most symbolic representation of his presence. This is the symbolic rejection of everything dear to the people. It is real stripping away of their identity, their history, and their relationship with God. As we go further down the chapter, the divine anger reaches into the crevices of life in Jerusalem. The elders are sitting on the ground, silent, under violent sittings with ashes on them. Young women bow their heads shamefully. Youngsters faint due to hunger in the streets. The whole community goes low. None have escaped the pain and suffering. Where peals of rejoicing and adoration once rang, screams of desperation now echo across the city. My eyes are spent with weeping. My stomach churns are the cries of Jeremiah, as if in dun witness to this disaster. Every time the prophet sees something, he does not stand aloof. He is moved by the things he is seeing and shares sorrows with his people. But perhaps one of the most powerful times in this chapter comes when Jeremiah turns his attention to children. Behold, O Lord, and consider. To whom hast thou done this? He exclaims, pointing to the dying children and infants in the streets. Should women eat the fruit of their womb? He asks, hinting at unspeakable horrors of famine and despair. This is one of those questions that is both an accusation and a plea. Jeremiah here utters his own cry of anguish, as he boldly and desperately cries out to God to look at these sufferings of the innocent and to reconsider his actions. It is a bold and desperate cry that shows the depth of the pain and confusion within the prophet. At the end of chapter 2, Jeremiah summarizes the destruction with a vivid metaphor. The heart of the people cry to the Lord. Let tears stream down like a torrent day and night. Here the cry is no more for life, but to mourn the loss. The people are summoned to sob unendingly, to give fully and completely into their sorrow. This is the only fitting response to the disaster they are beholding. No immediate hope, no comfort is afforded at the end of this chapter. Rather, Jeremiah has left us with an image of a people utterly shattered, crying out to a God who appears impassive and unresponsive. Chapter 3 in the Book of Lamentations is a turning point. While despair and the overwhelming sense of God's wrath envelop the first 2 chapters, Chapter 3 brings a subtle yet powerful shift. Here lies a reflection from Jeremiah, speaking as the man afflicted, on his own suffering and an attempt to grapple with the possibility of hope. This chapter is both literally and thematically the heart of this book. It contains in its verses arguably the most well-known verses in all of Lamentations, verses which many believers have clung to during desperate times. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. But prior to this hopeful declaration comes a trip into personal agony and torture, while mirroring the catastrophe of the people and the city itself. The chapter opens with the words, "I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath." Here's where Jeremiah, who from the beginning up to this point has spoken as a spokesperson to the people, now speaks as an individual. He is at once presented as a figure of representation, voicing the pain of the nation, but articulating his own personal agony. The imagery in these opening verses is vivid and visceral. Jeremiah talks of being cast into darkness, his flesh and skin wasting away, being besieged with bitterness and tribulation. He feels confined. God has walled him in on every side, affording no avenue of escape. This feeling of confinement lies at the core of suffering. This is as if God were his jailer, having kept him in and showing no mercy to him. As the chapter wears on, the suffering is turned up. Jeremiah speaks of being shut out and his cries ignored. "Even when I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer." This is a devastating admission for a prophet, a man whose life was built on his relationship with God. This pain cuts deeper than any physical affliction, to feel abandoned by God, to have one's prayers go unanswered. Jeremiah's imagery of being hunted like a bear or a lion simply adds to the sense of helplessness. God, who once protected him, now stalks him, awaiting an opportunity for an attack. One of the major themes that permeate this book is the role reversal. God is enemy rather than ally. The book makes again and again that suffering is not simply the hand of human cruelty, but a direct judgment from God himself. The people, having turned away from him, produced lamentations. Amid this anguish, Jeremiah pauses to express a deep sense of bitterness. He says, "He has filled me with bitterness. He has sated me with wormwood." Wormwood is a bitter herb, symbolic of sorrow and suffering. The idea that God himself has made Jeremiah drink bitterness is profound. It speaks to the completeness of his suffering. There is no part of him, no thought, no emotion, no sense that is not touched by pain. He goes on to say, "He has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cower in ashes." The imagery here is physical and visceral, meant to make the reader feel the discomfort and agony. Jeremiah's suffering is total, affecting not just his body but his mind and spirit as well. Yet, even as Jeremiah describes his suffering, something remarkable happens. A shift begins to take place in his language and tone. In verse 21, he suddenly declares, "But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope." This is the first mention of hope in the entire book. Up until this point, the tone has been unrelentingly bleak, with no indication that things might get better. But here, in the very midst of his despair, Jeremiah remembers something that gives him hope. What is it that he remembers? He remembers the character of God. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. These verses are a beacon of light in the darkness. They remind us that God's anger, though fierce, is not eternal. His love and mercy are greater than his wrath. This is a profound truth, especially in the context of Lamentations. Even amid the city's destruction and the people's suffering, Jeremiah clings to the knowledge that God is still merciful, still loving, and still faithful. His mercies are new every morning, meaning that every day brings a new opportunity for grace and restoration. This declaration is not just wishful thinking, it is a statement of faith. Jeremiah believes that God's love is more powerful than his judgment, and that belief is what sustains him in his darkest hour. Jeremiah continues to build on this newfound hope. "The Lord is my portion," he says, "therefore I will hope in him." The term portion here is significant. In ancient Israel, a person's portion referred to their inheritance, their share of the land, or their place in the community. To say that the Lord is his portion means that Jeremiah has placed his entire trust and hope in God alone. Even though everything else has been stripped away, his city, his people, his sense of security, he still has God. This is a powerful declaration of faith, especially suffering. It shows that true hope is not based on circumstances, but on the character of God. Jeremiah then goes on to reflect on the nature of suffering. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord, he writes. This statement might seem surprising given the intensity of the suffering he has just described. But Jeremiah sees value in waiting, in enduring suffering with patience and faith. He believes that suffering, though painful, can serve a purpose. It can teach us humility, patience, and dependence on God. For the Lord will not cast off forever, he says, but though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. This is a reminder that God's anger is not his final word. His compassion and love are greater, and they will ultimately prevail. In the later part of chapter 3, the idea of the struggle between suffering and hope is thoroughly examined. Jeremiah acknowledges the pain and bitterness of the present, but insists that it is not the end of the story. He calls on the people to examine and test their ways, and return to the Lord. This is a call to repentance, but also to renewal. Jeremiah believes that if the people turn back to God, he will restore them. Let us lift up our hearts and hands to God in heaven, he urges, showing that even in the midst of suffering, worship and prayer are still possible. However, the chapter does not end on a completely positive note. After this hopeful interlude, Jeremiah returns to the reality of the people's suffering. He describes in painful detail how the enemies mock and taunt the people, how they have been hunted down and destroyed. I am filled with bitterness, he says again, reminding us that even hope does not erase the reality of pain. There is no quick fix, no easy resolution. The suffering is real, and it is ongoing. Yet, even in this return to sorrow, the hope of God's mercy lingers in the background. As chapter 3 concludes, Jeremiah turns his gaze back to God. You have seen the wrong done to me, O Lord. Judge my cause. This is a plea for justice, a cry for God to intervene and set things right. Jeremiah's hope is not just that the suffering will end, but that God will act to restore justice and righteousness. He believes that God is not indifferent to their pain, but is watching, waiting for the right time to bring redemption. This sets the stage for the next chapter, where the focus will shift back to the people's suffering, but with a deeper understanding of God's role in it. As we move forward, we will see how this newfound hope influences the way Jeremiah and the people respond to their ongoing trials. Chapter 4 of Lamentations brings us deeper into the devastation of Jerusalem by focusing on the complete collapse of the social and moral fabric of the city. While the previous chapter introduced a glimmer of hope, this chapter returns to a tone of unrelenting sorrow. It shows us the consequences of the destruction from a very human perspective. Families torn apart, children starving, and leaders who have lost all their honor and influence. Jeremiah walks us through the ruins of a once great city, pointing out how everyone, from the highest noble to the humblest child, has been deeply affected. The sense of reversal and brokenness is pervasive. Those who were once clothed in luxury now lie in the dust, and the leaders who were once revered are now scorned. The chapter explores not only the physical suffering of the people, but also the collapse of their social order and moral integrity. The chapter begins with a poignant question: how the gold has grown dim, how the pure gold is changed. Here, Jeremiah uses the metaphor of gold losing its luster to describe the people of Jerusalem. They were once considered precious and valued, but now they have been reduced to worthlessness. This change is not just about their material wealth, but about their spiritual state. The once golden people of God are now covered in shame and dishonor. This metaphor of dimmed gold sets the tone for the entire chapter. It's as if the very essence of who they were has been tarnished and corroded by the judgment that has fallen upon them. Jeremiah then shifts his focus to the suffering of the children. He describes how even the little ones, who once played happily in the streets, are now starving and begging for food. The tongue of the nursing infant sticks to the roof of its mouth for thirst, he says, painting a heartbreaking picture of desperate hunger. The most vulnerable members of society, the children and infants, are the ones who suffer the most. This image is meant to evoke a deep sense of sorrow and outrage. The sight of children crying out for bread and receiving none is one of the most harrowing consequences of the city's fall. It symbolizes the complete breakdown of society. The adults have failed to protect and provide for their children, leaving them to suffer the consequences of sins they did not commit. Jeremiah's lament continues as he contrasts the present suffering of the people with their former glory. He describes how those who were once swathed in purple, a color symbolizing wealth and royalty, now embrace ash heaps. The imagery of princes and nobles reduced to scavenging in the dirt is jarring. It's a powerful visual representation of the theme of reversal that runs through this chapter. The mighty have fallen, and those who were once revered are now despised. The reversal of fortunes is complete. The people who once commanded respect and authority are now viewed with pity and scorn. This is not just a physical fall, but a social and moral collapse. Jeremiah then turns his attention to the priests and prophets who should have been guiding the people spiritually. The hands of compassionate women have boiled their own children, he writes, referencing the horrifying consequences of the famine that struck Jerusalem. This verse is one of the most disturbing in the entire book. It shows the depth of desperation and moral corruption that has taken hold. Even the natural compassion of mothers has been turned into something monstrous. This extreme imagery is meant to shock the reader, to show how far the people have fallen. When even the most basic human instincts are corrupted, it is a sign that society has reached its lowest point. The theme of moral collapse is reinforced as Jeremiah describes the fate of the city's leaders. The princes, once brighter than snow and whiter than milk, are now blacker than soot. This stark contrast emphasizes the dramatic transformation that has taken place. Their appearance mirrors the inner corruption and degradation that have consumed them. The leaders who should have been guiding the people have become symbols of the city's ruin. They wander aimlessly, without purpose or direction, unable to offer any help or hope. The collapse of leadership is one of the most devastating aspects of the city's downfall. Without strong and righteous leaders, the people are left like sheep without a shepherd, vulnerable and lost. But the suffering is not limited to the leaders. Jeremiah describes how the common people are equally affected. He speaks of the young men and women who are crushed under the weight of the enemy's oppression. Young women are raped in Zion, young men in the streets of the city. The violence and degradation inflicted on the people is relentless. It is not just a loss of life, but a loss of dignity. The people have been stripped of everything, left exposed and humiliated. This complete loss of honor and dignity is perhaps the most painful aspect of the suffering. It is not just their bodies that have been broken, but their spirits. One of the key themes in this chapter is the loss of identity. The people of Jerusalem were once proud of their heritage, their status as God's chosen people. But now, all of that has been taken away. They are no longer a nation of priests and kings, but a scattered and broken people. This loss of identity is symbolized in the destruction of the temple and the desecration of the sacred places. The very symbols of their covenant relationship with God have been defiled. Without these symbols, the people are left wondering who they are and what their place is in the world. This identity crisis adds another layer to their suffering. It is not just a physical or emotional pain, but a spiritual one as well. Jeremiah also touches on the role of foreign nations in Jerusalem's downfall. He speaks of how the people were betrayed by those they thought were allies. Our eyes failed, ever watching vainly for help. In our watching, we watched for a nation which could not save. This line reveals the sense of betrayal and abandonment the people felt. They had placed their trust in political alliances instead of in God, and those alliances failed them. Now they are left alone, without any help or support. This realization adds to their sense of isolation and despair. They are truly alone, abandoned by friends and forsaken by God. The chapter ends with a reflection on the full extent of the suffering. Jeremiah describes how the people's enemies gloat and hiss over them, taking pleasure in their downfall. This final image of mockery and ridicule is a fitting end to a chapter filled with sorrow and pain. It shows that the suffering is not just internal but external as well. The people are humiliated in front of the entire world, their disgrace made public for all to see. This public humiliation is the final blow, stripping away the last vestiges of pride and honor. They are left utterly broken, with no one to defend them or stand up for their cause. But even as the chapter closes on this somber note, there is a hint of defiance in Jeremiah's words. "Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, but to you also the cup shall pass. You shall become drunk and strip yourself bare." Here, Jeremiah turns his gaze outward, addressing the enemies who have mocked and oppressed Jerusalem. His words are a reminder that God's judgment is not limited to his own people. The nations that have taken pleasure in Jerusalem's suffering will also face judgment. This declaration sets the stage for the final chapter, where we will see the people's desperate plea for God's mercy and restoration. Chapter 5 of Lamentations is the final poem in this collection, and it marks a shift from sorrowful lament to a communal prayer. Unlike the earlier chapters, which are filled with vivid descriptions of the city's devastation and intense personal suffering, Chapter 5 takes on the voice of the community as a whole. It is as if the people, after reflecting on their pain and the cause of their suffering, have come together to cry out to God with one unified voice. There is no intricate structure here, no acrostic pattern like the earlier chapters. Instead, the language is more direct, the tone more desperate. This chapter reads like a plea, a desperate appeal from a broken people who have lost everything and are now turning their gaze upward, hoping for some sign of God's mercy. The chapter opens with a simple yet profound request. "Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace." This opening line is a plea for God to notice their suffering. It reveals the depth of their pain and their fear that God has turned his face away from them. To ask God to remember is not just a request for him to recall events, but a plea for him to act. In the Bible, when God remembers, it often means he is about to intervene. By beginning with this word, the people are expressing their hope that despite everything, God might still look upon them with compassion and bring about some form of relief. Jeremiah then gives voice to the long list of grievances and losses that the people have endured. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to foreigners. The land that was once their own, passed down through generations, is now occupied by their enemies. This loss of inheritance is not just about losing property. It is a loss of identity and heritage. For the people of Israel, the land was a sign of God's promise and blessing. To have it taken away meant losing their place in God's plan. This sense of disinheritance is compounded by the loss of their social structure. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows. Here, Jeremiah uses the imagery of broken families to reflect the state of the nation. The people feel abandoned, like children left without parents, vulnerable and alone. As the poem continues, Jeremiah catalogs the various hardships the people face daily. We must pay for the water we drink. The wood we get must be bought. These simple, everyday necessities, water and wood, have now become luxuries. The people are no longer free in their own land. They are like strangers, forced to beg for what they once took for granted. This line captures the humiliation and powerlessness of their situation. They have gone from being a proud and independent nation to a people who must scrape together resources just to survive. This reversal of fortunes is a recurring theme in Lamentations. The once powerful have become weak, the once rich have become poor, and the once secure have become utterly exposed. Jeremiah also highlights the violence and oppression the people suffer under foreign rule. Our pursuers are at our necks. We are weary. We are given no rest. This line captures the relentless pressure and persecution that people endure. There is no respite, no break from the suffering. They are constantly hounded, as if they are living in a state of perpetual fear. This unrelenting oppression has drained them of all strength and hope. The image of being pursued at our necks suggests a life lived on the edge, always under threat, never able to breathe freely. The prophet then turns to the moral and spiritual collapse of the community. Our fathers sinned and are no more, and we bear their iniquities. This acknowledgement of generational sin is crucial. The people recognize that they are suffering not only for their own sins, but also for the accumulated disobedience of their ancestors. This line expresses a deep sense of injustice and sorrow. They are paying the price for sins they did not commit, bearing the burden of a broken covenant that has been violated time and again. But at the same time, there is an implicit acceptance. They do not accuse God of being unjust. Instead, they acknowledge the reality of their situation and the depth of their brokenness. The suffering described in this chapter is not limited to one group, but affects every segment of society. Jeremiah speaks of how young men are forced to grind at the mill, a job typically reserved for slaves and prisoners. Young men are compelled to grind, and boys stagger under loads of wood. The strong young men who should have been the future of the nation are now reduced to performing menial, backbreaking labor. The boys, who should be playing and learning, are instead carrying heavy burdens. This is a society that has lost its future. Its young men are broken, its children are weighed down, and its leaders are gone. The picture Jeremiah paints is one of utter devastation. One of the most painful images in this chapter is the description of how the women and young girls are treated. Women are raped in Zion, young women in the towns of Judah. This line is brief, but its impact is profound. It reveals the depths of humiliation and dishonor the people have experienced. The physical suffering is terrible, but the psychological and emotional pain is even greater. The community's dignity has been trampled and their sense of security shattered. The suffering is not just physical, but also deeply spiritual. The people's identity and sense of worth have been stripped away. The poem then turns to a reflection on leadership, or the lack thereof. Princes are hung up by their hands. No respect is shown to the elders. This line shows how the leaders, who should have been protecting and guiding the people, have been publicly humiliated and killed. The hanging of princes is a brutal reminder that the power structures that once upheld society are now gone. The elders, who were once revered for their wisdom, are now disregarded. This breakdown of leadership has left the people directionless and vulnerable. As the chapter draws to a close, Jeremiah returns to the theme of the people's broken spirit. The joy of our hearts has ceased. Our dancing has been turned to mourning. This is not just a statement about the loss of external circumstances, but a reflection of the inner despair that has taken hold. The people's joy, their sense of purpose, their hope for the future, all have been extinguished. The once vibrant community is now a shell of its former self, filled only with mourning and lament. The final verses of the chapter are a plea for God's mercy. But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? Here, Jeremiah acknowledges God's sovereignty, even amid their suffering. He recognizes that God is still on his throne, still in control, even though it feels like he has abandoned them. This acknowledgement is a statement of faith, a declaration that, despite everything, they still believe God has the power to restore them. The chapter ends with a desperate plea. Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us, and you remain exceedingly angry with us. This final prayer is both hopeful and fearful. The people want to believe that God will restore them, that he will bring them back into a relationship with himself. But there is also a lingering doubt, a fear that perhaps this time the break is final, and God's anger will never be turned away. This tension between hope and fear is the essence of Lamentations. It captures the deep sorrow of people who are suffering the consequences of their actions, but are still clinging to the hope that God's mercy is greater than his wrath. With this chapter, Lamentations comes to a close, not with a resolution, but with a question. It ends with the people in a state of uncertainty, still in their suffering, still waiting for God to respond. This unresolved ending is what makes Lamentations such a powerful and moving book. It does not offer easy answers or quick solutions. Instead, it leaves us with the reality of suffering and the hope that somehow, in ways we cannot yet see, God will act to restore his people. The raw emotions of Lamentations invite us to be honest in our struggles, to voice our pain without fear, and to seek God with all our hearts. It is a call to come before him as we are, in our suffering and despair, and to trust that He is still present, still listening, and still able to transform our darkest nights into new dawns of hope and healing. This kind of faith, the faith to keep asking, keep seeking, and keep hoping, is what carries us through the wilderness of grief and loss. So as we close our study of this profound and challenging book, let us not turn away from our own laments, but instead embrace them as opportunities to draw closer to God. Let us be a people who cry out boldly for healing, and who, like the voices in Lamentations, refuse to let pain be the final word. Let us be willing to ask God to renew our days as of old, trusting that despite our brokenness, He is still the God of restoration. If this journey has moved you, I encourage you to take a moment of reflection and prayer. Ask yourself, what are the areas in your life that need God's renewing touch? Where are the places of deep sorrow that need His healing light? And are you willing to trust Him even when you cannot see the way forward? Remember, no matter how great the ruin, God's ability to rebuild is even greater. Seek Him, call upon Him, and hold on to the hope that His mercies truly are new every morning. Amen.